It was supposed to be the perfect crime. A small team of professional thieves, an $80 million payday, and one of the most valuable private art collections in the world. The plan was simple: get in, grab the goods, and get out before anyone even knew they were there. But in the world of crime, things rarely go as planned. August 12th, 2015. In the dead of night, under the cover of a rain-soaked sky, 4 men entered the palatial estate of art collector Richard Belmont. The Belmont Mansion, an architectural marvel nestled in the quiet suburbs of New York City, was home to some of the world's most coveted pieces of art. To the men slipping through its corridors that night, it wasn't just a house. It was an $80 million treasure trove waiting to be plundered. But this was no ordinary art heist. For one of the thieves, it was personal. What none of them knew, however, was that this job would spiral into a web of deceit, betrayal, and murder, one that would leave the nation gripped in shock and confusion. The thieves had planned every detail with precision. They had studied Belmont's movements, the security measures, even the habits of his loyal guard dogs. Inside, men had been planted within the estate's staff months earlier. The night of the heist, those insiders cut the power to the security cameras, jammed alarms, and deactivated motion sensors. It was as if the mansion was waiting for them, and then they were in. A Rembrandt here, a Picasso there. Within minutes, they were pulling millions of dollars worth of priceless art from the walls and slipping them into duffel bags. It seemed everything was going according to plan. But as the last canvas was slipped into a protective case, something went wrong. A noise, a faint creak in the floorboards, cut through the silence of the mansion. The thieves froze. Someone else was in the house. The thieves were professionals, calm, collected, methodical. But the faint creak of the floorboards shattered their sense of control. They exchanged panicked glances, the adrenaline coursing through their veins. Their perfect plan had just become anything but. From the shadows emerged Victoria Belmont, the lady of the house. She had woken from her sleep to investigate the odd hum of footsteps. She stood there, frozen, in her silk robe, staring wide-eyed at the intruders who were not supposed to be there. Marcus, the leader of the crew, immediately grabbed her. "She can't leave," he muttered through gritted teeth, panic overtaking his careful planning. Victoria struggled, but Marcus held her firm. In that moment, the thieves were no longer just art thieves. They were in danger of becoming something far worse. And then, from behind them, Nick, the rookie of the group, pulled out a gun. "No other way," he said, voice trembling but face cold. Before the others could stop him, there was a deafening bang. Victoria collapsed to the floor, lifeless. The next morning, the police were called. Detective Rachel Monroe, seasoned and sharp, was put on the case. As she entered the Belmont mansion, she could immediately tell something was off. This wasn't just a burglary. Something darker had occurred. As she combed through the crime scene, she found something the thieves had missed. A single fingerprint on the edge of a broken frame. It was a small clue, but it was enough. In the forensics lab, the fingerprint was matched. Nick, a small-time crook, was immediately identified. Now it was a race against time to find him before the trail went cold. In the interrogation room, Nick was sweating bullets. Under the pressure of Monroe's questioning, he cracked. He told them everything: the heist, the murder, the cover-up. But something didn't sit right with Monroe. She knew there was more to this story. The robbery was clean, professional, but the murder, that was different. Someone else was pulling the strings. Back at the station, Monroe dove deeper into the case. The puzzle pieces were slowly coming together, but there was one lead that changed everything: an anonymous tip. A witness had come forward. Someone had seen movement in the mansion the night of the heist, but it wasn't just the thieves. Someone else had been there, someone close to the family. Back at the mansion, Monroe and her team uncovered a file hidden in plain sight. It was enough to point her toward someone far more dangerous than Nick. James Belmont, Victoria's brother. Monroe now had enough to start building her case. James had the motive, the means, and the perfect alibi. But now, his carefully crafted plan was starting to unravel. Monroe stood outside the mansion, piecing together the story in her mind. She was close to the truth, but bringing James to justice would be no easy task. As Detective Monroe pored over the evidence, a troubling connection began to emerge. The clues all pointed to someone with deep ties to the family, someone who stood to gain the most from Victoria's death: her brother, James Belmont. James had always lived in his sister's shadow, watching her grow the Belmont estate into a cultural empire. But there was more to it. His exclusion from the will was the final insult, the motive for everything. Monroe confronted James at his office, laying out the evidence before him. But James remained calm, his face betraying no emotion as she accused him of orchestrating the heist and the murder. "You think you know everything," James said coolly, "but you're only scratching the surface." Just as Monroe was about to leave, something caught her eye, a hidden drawer behind his desk. She opened it to find a stack of documents. Among them was the smoking gun, detailed plans of the mansion's security system, transactions from the sale of black market art. James had been planning this for years. Back at the station, Monroe briefed her team. They now had the evidence to bring James Belmont down. But there was still one piece missing: the stolen art. Where had it gone? As James sat alone in his mansion, the weight of his actions finally started to sink in. He had thought he was invincible, that no one would ever uncover the truth. But now, the walls were closing in. Detective Monroe returned to the Belmont mansion, this time armed with the final piece of evidence. She confronted James once again, laying everything bare: his motive, his plans, and his betrayal of his sister. James, for the first time, showed signs of cracking. "You think this is over?" he sneered. "It's only just begun." But James had one more card to play. Just before Monroe arrived, a shadowy figure had slipped him a document, proof that he wasn't working alone. There were others more powerful than him who had been pulling the strings all along. In a desperate move, James made a final call to his contact, hoping for a way out. But it was too late. The web of lies had unraveled, and there was no escaping now. Monroe, knowing the end was near, drove through the night with a singular focus: to bring James Belmont to justice. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and there was no turning back. James Belmont was finally arrested, his empire crumbling around him. The once great estate that had stood for wealth and power was now a hollow shell of its former self. With James behind bars, Monroe knew that the case was over. But something still didn't feel right. Inside the mansion, the empty frame where a priceless painting once hung seemed to taunt her. The room was quiet now, but the echoes of that night still reverberated through the halls. Where had the art gone? Monroe knew that the case wasn't fully closed. Not yet. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed as James was led away in handcuffs. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but James said nothing. He knew that even from prison, the secrets of the Belmont family would remain hidden. Back in her office, Monroe sat at her desk, reviewing the files one last time. She had done her job, but the lingering sense of unfinished business weighed heavily on her mind. The Belmont mansion stood at the edge of town, its once grand halls now empty and quiet. The world had moved on, but the secrets hidden within those walls had not. In the weeks that followed, James Belmont stood trial for his crimes. The courtroom was tense, with the eyes of the world watching. The jury deliberated for days, but in the end, there was only one verdict: guilty. James sat motionless as the judge read out his sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who had once controlled an empire now faced a future behind bars. Outside the courthouse, the press hounded Detective Monroe for a statement. "Justice was served today," she said. "But there's still more to this story." The reporters pressed for more, but Monroe kept her cards close to her chest. Back at her office, Monroe opened the morning paper. Guilty verdict. James Belmont sentenced to life in prison. She folded the paper and placed it on her desk, staring at the headline for a long moment. The case was closed, but for Monroe, the questions still lingered. The Belmont mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now stood empty, its halls filled with silence. The paintings, the wealth, the family, everything was gone. But the shadows of the past still lingered, and as Monroe looked at the mansion one last time, she knew that some mysteries were never meant to be solved.